I must give you thanks, dear friends, for reading these letters and encouraging me despite my imperfections. The critique of religion that begins with the Enlightenment may be roughly divided into two phases, or rather two approaches. One is the attempt to demystify religion by purging fundamentalism and integrate the religious impulse into an emancipatory vision for society. This is arguably the line of Kant and Feuerbach, of Matthew Arnold, and to some extent Schopenhauer. The second approach holds that religion is an evil by definition, and that proving its theological inadequacy is enough to turn everyone away from it. This is the understanding of Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Bertrand Russell, and Voltaire. I disagree with the latter. It is not the case, as they hope, that after showing God does not exist, we are done with religion. They have not noticed that Buddhism is an atheistic religion. It is a naive, yet grave mistake to conflate the psychological complexity of the religious experience with concrete beliefs. The anthropological pertinence of religion has nothing to do with the question of God's existence. I am happy to defend that religious beliefs and practices ought to be less dogmatic, fundamentalist, and authoritarian. What I reject is the argument that religion is the ultimate source of dogmatism, fundamentalism, authoritarianism. The eminent Bertrand Russell, explaining why he is not a Christian, convincingly produces a long list of evils perpetrated and perpetuated by churches that consistently opposed social and cultural reform. The Anglican Church connived at the scourge of slavery. To this day, the most conservative opposition to progress, reform, and extended rights comes from overzealous Christian groups. Yet Mr. Russell's picture makes you believe these evils would not exist if religion were suddenly removed from the world. This is not how it is. The prejudices, the bias, and destructive structures of a society are not dictated by a single group that contaminates all others, but are the result of complex institutional symbioses. We must take heed of assuming the world was the joyful banquet of the free and enlightened until some wicked priests came along and ruined everything. I commend Mr. Russell's eagerness to condemn the churches that supported slavery, but I miss the same eagerness to condemn his alma mater, the University of Cambridge, or the many governments of the day that advocated colonial policies, which, maybe to the surprise of the distinguished Richard Dawkins, were not quite dictated by the Anglican Church. I will not weaken the argument with whataboutery. The churches deserve all of Russell's criticisms, but I do not argue the University of Cambridge ought to be closed down because Victorian academics have favorable views on colonialism, or that everyone should be turned away from Christianity because a number of evangelicals oppose democracy. I argue instead that the evils a religion comes to represent are the evils it inherits from the society in which it breathes. I argue it is not possible to single out an institution as the ultimate source of undesirable social structures and cultural norms. On the contrary, such structures and norms only become pervasive when all major institutions of society converge to enable them in a long-term effort. The fallacy in Mr. Russell's otherwise sharp reasoning is this. A. Institution X promotes cause Y. B. Institution X commits political mistakes. C. Therefore, cause Y must not be promoted. I hope religious readers will not rejoice too much at my words on Mr. Russell, whom I greatly admire, because my letters are hardly likely to please anyone. The Cambridge atheists who claim religion is nonsense because they know God is a lie will not be pleased with my attempt to pick up the pieces, as it were, and lay the foundations for a more solid building based on the anthropological and psychological potential of demystified religion as a force for good. The venerable clergyman in the Anglo-Saxon parish will be equally displeased with my rejection of theological eccentricities. It is clearly not an easy task to please reason and mankind together. But I trust you shall share this collection of letters with great care in these times of exaggerated sensitivity. I could only write as openly as I did, because of the trust that guides our friendship in spite of the cordial disagreements. While I put forward a critique of religion, it is not the critique most of you would expect, but it is the voice, if this counts, of my authentic thinking. I call these letters spiritual. The word spiritual has a long history in philosophy, but gradually fell into obscurity. It now refers to esoteric, mystic, religious pursuits. But I use it in the old sense. A spiritual reflection is concerned with abstraction and ideality, with the discursive, the structural, the critical, even the pragmatic, as a deconstruction of the material. Spiritual is everything that refers to the mind and its exertions. Some might dismiss my Cartesian use of the word as fetishism, but I had no other choice. It would be impossible to call these letters philosophical, although they entail a philosophical critique of religion, and though at times they might be difficult to read without philosophical knowledge. The conversational tone you allowed me to choose is not regarded as serious writing in the academic temples of philosophy. It has been discouraged by men of no lesser stature than Hegel. Yet it would be a disservice to our friendship if I addressed you in the contrived manner of a journal. Moreover, there is no longer philosophy as we used to know it. Conceptual analysis is now dismissed in analytic philosophy as a pursuit of belles lettres. I certainly do not object to the sweetness and light of literature, but you know very well the poor fruits of my style. These letters do not have the youthful elan of the most magnificent Daily Mail, or the grace of Ross Douthat composing for the New York Times. The time I could have spent learning New Age writing, I was dedicating to the study of Hobbes, Locke, Hume. To add insult to injury, I spent many years studying the works of Plato and Aristotle before I learned Greek, and they were only available in 19th century translations, not to mention the older German philosophy I have read ever since. It is sad to acknowledge it, but these ugly styles sooner or later contaminate your own. I have reason to believe my letters will not qualify for the Nobel Prize. But neither did Boris Johnson's enlightened biography of Churchill, despite so much praise from the Daily Telegraph. I can only hope you will kindly direct your friends to Schopenhauer, if they take exception with the length of my paragraphs. I have accepted your challenge, indeed, to write down these contemplations we have discussed for more than 15 years, but I agreed under the condition, as you remember, that you will accept whatever style and grammar I deliver. I found it inappropriate to submit my work, including the German postface, to proofreaders, when my audience is only 7 friends from whom, for the love of God, I do not need to hide my language mistakes, not after sharing my very nakedness with some of you. I am content that William, Heine, and most of you have read the texts, and that grave mistakes have been pointed out. Those that haven't are obviously not grave enough to confuse your reading. Why letters? I shall write a temerity. It is impossible to answer without aggrieving many. But read on. The Enlightenment has failed in its cultural ambition. It could not prevent the horrors of colonialism, imperialism, totalitarianism. It even accelerated those. It could not prevent the subversion of emancipatory values by industrial progress at the service of profit maximization. I have no desire to charge money for the perusal of my letters, just as Socrates would not charge to converse, and just as the Pope does not write encyclicals in exchange for tips. Yet the printed book of our time is only conceivable as a commodity. Its mission has been subsumed into the laws of demand and supply. The world would become a much better place if many read this book, but I sigh in great relief, knowing the world does not need my letters, since all the world needs is money. Were I to write for the benefit of a global audience and take up the tremendous labors of reaching such, I should need to pay proofreaders, reviewers, agents, publishers, radio broadcasters, TV presenters, influencers, journalists, social media owners, and how long is a piece of string? This is quite an extravagant retinue of servants for a commoner to entertain. I believe in the utopia of a book above this, beyond the sharks and vultures whose greed has demolished the free circulation of ideas, for them to make a sad living from the book industry. Had they made a living from selling their bodies, less harm would have come to society. For a while, I was even tempted to use my olive complexion to ingratiate myself with their tokenism. But then the spirit of Socrates, who is apparently white, appeared to me in a dream and said it would be indecorous to seek favor with those who need to see the body before they hear the soul. Those who regard the written word only as a source of income either have nothing noble to say or have not understood the pursuit of writing. Do not be baffled to hear books may be written to convey a pertinent thought, and it ought to be possible to reach an audience by transparent means, even though currently I cannot think of any. This, however, is the very ideal the Enlightenment failed to materialize. Writing was destined to be appropriated by what Adorno calls the culture industry. I therefore have no choice but to revert to 17th century standards, where in the lack of emancipatory book publishing structures, the men of letters, who were called so for a reason, could only write letters to a limited audience and see what happens. Il faut cultiver notre jardin. I must pay homage to my mother, who gave me a copy of Candide when I was 10. God forgive her, for she knew not what she was doing. I count myself lucky that by writing a letter to Carrie, at least Carrie will read the letter. Yet by trying to publish an essay to no particular addressee under the illusion of writing for the entire world, I shall find no reader. Producing a book involves costs. If the author is not covering those by herself, and if no one else is doing it as a service to society, a book will only arise through questionable compromises. This is how my writing ethos is irreconcilable with the publishing ethos. The thought of submitting these letters to a publisher would trivialize the magnitude of matters which, misunderstood as commodities, would lose their gravity. It would defeat the purpose of my writing. The letter is the only form of expression that holds fast above the mercantile approach. The book industry should never have been allowed to reach the point it now has, an illiberal business that has destroyed literature and culture as the study of perfection. To quote Arnold, but also to evoke Voltaire, a testimony to the failure of the Enlightenment. In breeding a society of alienated light fiction readers, the book industry and its partners play a serious role in the intellectual collapse of our age, with severe consequences for democracy, human rights, and all that is refined, delicate, and enlightening in the pursuit of culture. I enjoin you to reject their vision for the role of the book in society. But to make a concession to the greatness of the modern world, I have allied myself with the Lorenzo de' Medici of our time, the visionary Jeff Bezos, who, in his disinterested liberality, has set up a platform on Amazon to emancipate us from industrial constraints. I am finally allowed to pay for my own author copies. Mankind is truly headed for salvation. Now you may tell your friends that my letters, or rather yours, may well be ordered if anyone will give me the payment of her attention, and pay Lorenzo for printing and shipping his product. Yet my reasons are not purely based on social criticism. The art letter allows a degree of intimacy, of freedom, of delicacy in argumentation that a standardized essay cannot produce. It is, as a matter of principle, the superior choice, where the aesthetic integrity of thinking remains unsullied. Because it is not a genre, it is the abolition of genre, authority, business, imposture. Nobody can tell you how to write a letter. It is the only frame of writing that allows me to argue as a human being, because the human being is not a genre. It is the whole world in one head. I owe it to the freedom of my letters, which no university press could accommodate, that I may talk of my love of trees while discussing the inadequacy of reason. I distinguish between confessions and contemplations. In the former, I write from a personal perspective, and the confessions you will find are revelations of my inner world. I must repeat myself. Although my letters have a cause to defend, if I want my words to be worthy of a human being, I must speak, not as an arguing machine, a task in which chatbots will soon outperform us, but indeed as a human being, in a language that conveys not only the argument, but also the frailty of the person behind the argument, writing as I am to some of the most important people in my life. It is sad that only Montaigne understood, and later Proust, how to put forward an argument in a humane way. My confessions are not, as some might expect, an acknowledgement of sins, because sins do not belong to my understanding of spiritual dignity. The contemplations, on the other hand, are more focused on argumentation. I have resorted to a number of tools for an exposition more fitting to the brittle sweetness of the English language, even where the heaviness of the topic would have required Hegel's tongue. My first letter is a reflection on the psychological meaning of prayer, regardless of theology and denomination. It is followed by a contemplation on the uselessness of speculation about the afterlife, where I illustrate the inability of any conceivable afterlife scenario to provide compensation for the troubles of this life. I work with auxiliary dialogues, maybe a reminiscence of the 3 years I spent reading the complete work of Plato, to highlight the strengths and flaws of various arguments. Fortunately, William's fear that Milena, the addressee, might succumb to an overdose of Valium did not materialize. The third letter treats the spiritual meaning of sexuality, a frequent casualty of religion as a tool of desexualization. While I argue the desexualizing agenda predates religion, I refute the authority of sexual institutions, also cemented by religious discourse, marriage, family, parenthood, celibacy. I advance a broader concept of holiness, in which sexuality is embedded. Yet for some reason, I have lost a number of Christian friends after forwarding them a copy. They should have read the other works before judging the whole. The next letter is fundamental in proposing the concept of immanent content and its role in religion. It focuses on legitimate forms of communication for immanent content, based on the example of Socrates, Gautama, and Joshua as reference communicators. It then discusses the role of arbitrarization and the inadequacy of writing. The fifth letter is a confession of my frail approach to meditation and a reflection on its value regardless of concrete beliefs. Peace and Society, the sixth letter, contains the principles of my political thinking. It discusses, among other matters, the psychology of mass conciliation, which is implicitly the ultimate anthropological goal of religion, the concept of work as a tool of emancipation, the foundations of inequality, the theory of contracts, and the challenges of freedom and democracy. The letter is relevant in attenuating pessimistic echoes while discussing the holiness of conciliation. The last work is a contemplation of faith as a gradation of trust, cultivated independent of concrete beliefs. It entails a definition and rejection of fundamentalism and a declaration of spiritual rights indissociable from human dignity.